Hey, we're right here at the shopping mall called The Wall. Pretty interesting name for a shopping mall. But it's around here that I should be able to see the Apple Museum of Utrecht. The biggest Apple museum ever made. Because Apple, this year, as I'm recording this video, exists 50 years. Which obviously deserves a party. Of course, I cycled to the Apple Museum. And I took a couple of stops, for instance, at this Douwe Egberts building, which really did smell like coffee. Also at the Berlin Square, with the beautiful old station canopy. And at the shopping mall in the center of the city, which actually contains the interestingly named Vaartudsdijk. I also went ahead and relaxed a little bit at a water very close, and I made a recording of that on the dictation machine. Here at the Grauwaard Singel. Before I'm going to head indoors for about 2,000 square meters, which could take hours to explore. As this truck is apparently trying to leave the wall backwards, to truth though, Apple, I'm not really an Apple fan. I do use their iPad and GarageBand and I do quite enjoy it. I've actually been lumping them together with the other big tech companies under the name of Crapple. However, it is very much worth noting that Apple really had influenced computing beyond even its own products. And in addition, this museum isn't actually from Apple at all. It's from no, not that foundation. The Apple Museum Foundation. Of course, the foundation itself is set up by the same people who set up AMAC, the Netherlands' biggest import company for Apple products. Meanwhile, I'm going ahead and have a little look around here, and just until I have my official time slot. Here we are right on the parking lot of the Wall, the mall that we've entered. Walking straight into the doors of the Apple Museum. And I'm going to show you my time slot and my student card. It actually didn't have that apple of a price. I mean, 15 euros for the entry and a 25 euros in total to include a 10 euro donation I did to the foundation. Here's something kind of weird to see in the Apple Museum. This is an old Volkswagen bus, which apparently the founders of Apple had to sell 2 of their personal belongings. This is the Volkswagen bus and this HP calculator for a total of 750 plus 500 would be $1,250 US to create the first Apple computer. Here the doors are opening to a replica, of course, of the original garage in which Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs created the first Apple computer. This wasn't the first product of Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. That would have been a black box, a device to circumvent the phone system and make international calls much cheaper or even free. Once it worked, Wozniak and Jobs sold this device and saw potential in the electronics industry in general. This came a couple of years later, in 1976, the Apple I, the first computer to be available and usable for the general public. of course, you would have only bought the PCB. And around that PCB, you would need a couple components. You would need a case, you would need a keyboard, you would need a CCTV monitor for the video interface, and you may wish to get a tape deck and compact cassettes, which would allow you to save and load programs. The Apple I did come with this beautiful manual, which was written by Steve Wozniak and Ron Wayne, containing the circuit diagram and how to hook it up. There was no guidance on the software because the Apple I was intended for people who wanted to do it themselves, to already know how a computer works in the basics. But at least it would have been better than something like an Altair at the time, which would require manual switches to enter in bytecodes. This is an opened up example of its successor, the Apple II. This was the first computer to be completely assembled from Apple. And it brought personal computing in the hands of the general public. Steve Wozniak, of course, designed the motherboard and created an expandable system with a single PCB, just like the Apple I. Along with the Apple II in the center there, in 1977 also came two more ready-to-use computers. There was the TRS-80 by Radio Shack over in the US, and there was the Commodore PET, Personal Electronic Transactor. The PET and the TRS-80 ended up focusing more on Unity, and the TRS-80 in particular focused on affordability as well. The Apple I, however, was unique in these three in that it had an expandable system. Of course, Apple ended up winning the War of the Trinity, and the other two ended up getting bankrupt around the early 1990s. And of course, both licensed and unlicensed, there were quite a number of clones of the Apple II, which use pretty standardized components, and Apple includes schematics within Apple II. The only problem is the ROM, and practically all companies were struck down by Apple because the ROM was copyrighted, so the PR2 was actually a Dutch equivalent of the Apple II, which would have more expansion slots, but of course it had legal battles from Apple, and it's very rare. It became the PR-COM later on. Similarly, we had the Franklin H1000, about which the 8-bit guy, David, actually made a video. The Bell and Howell computers were among the first to be legally claimed. Of course, inspired by their own success, Apple also made some variants of their own, like the Apple II Plus in 1979, which have had Euro Plus in Europe and the J Plus in the Japanese domestic market, as well as the Apple IIc compact computer, the Apple IIe, which is enhanced for education and business use, for instance. It would have been kind of like the Apple IIc in a larger case. And the Apple IIgs, the graphical variant of the Apple II. The Apple I and II actually used the 6502 derivative. The Apple IIgs used the 16-bit variant, the 65816. Of course, Apple was now heavily investing in graphical interfaces, which leads us to the next part. Actually, before we go there, these are three other computers, the Apple III and Apple III Plus, which were intended for business use. They were very powerful compared to any Apple II. Unfortunately, there were technical issues which hindered the success of the Apple III and practically gave the market to this, the IBM PC. with MS-DOS. And of course all its clones, which would have used clean room engineering to remain legitimate. Apple's response is this, the Lisa. A basic computer with a graphical user interface. However, this thing was very expensive. You can see those two floppy drives right there, all in one, but it was very expensive. This was actually the first mouse ever made in 1964, the Engelbart mouse. Or at least this was a replica of that, the first device that we would now call a mouse. Of course, this would have led to the first mouse for the masses, which was the 1983 Lisa mouse. However, the Lisa was actually inspired on the Xerox computer, the Xerox Alto, which was intended for workspace use. This is the mouse that belongs with that. About the Apple Lisa, developed in 1983, we can find this quote. Lisa was ahead of its time. It introduced concepts that are now standard, but the world wasn't ready for it yet. We now pass another door to see the truth. The real truth. Lisa wasn't just a product. Lisa was a prototype for the Apple Macintosh and an inspiration for Microsoft Windows. Hello Macintosh. This came out in 1984. The Macintosh, as you can see there, was quite a bit smaller than the Lisa and uses 3.5-inch floppy drives. The mouse is very similar to that of the Lisa. This made it such that this computer could have been a bit cheaper than the Lisa and available for the rest of us. Here is the back of a typical Macintosh. As you can see at the bottom here, there's the mouse connector, floppy drive connector for an external floppy drive. The printer and serial connectors are actually 9-pin serial. Right there. This would have been intended for early telephone or packet radio modems, and this would have been used for an Apple laser writer. This was the first laser printer ever designed, and it allowed, together with a Macintosh's graphical user interface, desktop publishing, which uses the same typefaces in printing houses and publishing companies on a home computer. Together with this program here, out of Spacemaker, that set the scene. Side note, the Macintosh keyboard had no arrow keys at all, unlike the Apple II keyboard, which usually had 2 of them, but then 4 in a straight arrangement. Kind of weird when playing video games, for instance. And you also had to buy a separate number pad like this to use graphing software. Steve has left the building. We are now approaching the grey period, a period in which Apple didn't really know what it was. It had talent, but it didn't have a vision. This led to a flood of the market for Apple computers, potentially even including clones later on as well. But Apple II did still end up being the backbone, but it was held back to make way for the Macintosh, whereas the PC clones came along. It was 1990 when the Apple II was about to be discontinued, but Apple still had a big basis in education. The LC, or low-cost Macintosh, officially called Macintosh LC, was an attempt to regain ground, which actually was the first Macintosh to introduce color and could run Apple II software with a special card. These became known as the Peterbox Macs, and the Macintosh Performers followed this line as well. But it had slower processors than the original Macintosh, despite the LC became very popular. Another interesting side note are the Macintosh Portable and the PowerBook. Even though it was not PowerPC based, the Apple PowerBook was very important as it practically set the foundation for the design of modern computers. Laptop computers, that is, but still very true. In this shot are multiple products at once. There is the PowerBook Geo, which was an early hybrid computer, as well as the entire Newton line of products, which were a set of PDAs, or personal digital assistants. These PDAs were not very successful at their time, partly due to the price. This is the first set of Power Macintoshes. The older style Macintoshes used a Motorola 68000 CPU, and this was a logical continuation of that. The Power Macintosh PowerPC architecture was actually built out by Apple, IBM and Motorola together, and included a classic mode which allowed running 68000 software. It was by 1997 that Apple wanted to sell itself to other companies due to near bankruptcy performance. You can see the stock markets over here. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs has been up to this, the Next company. The Next computer company, which was started in 1985 by Steve Jobs and a couple of Apple employees, wanted to create powerful workstations for education and science. The Next computer would have laid the background for Apple macOS, if I'm saying it correctly, with the advanced Next Step operating system. It was expensive, and Jobs called it the best environment for building software. It was never a success, but it was a spark for later. Okay, my camera just died as I was about to go through a door into the area where Steve Jobs was back at Apple. Steve Jobs was CEO of Next, but Next was bought out by Apple, and he completely overhauled the company. Actually, he did what an AED and CPR do to a person who had a heart attack. He stopped everything and started over with at least basic products. 4 of them to be exact. The iMac, the iBook, the Power Mac and the PowerBook. As the 5th product, a kind of middle ground for entry-level consumers, Apple intended to use the G4 Cube. The G4 Cube is very beautiful, as you can see in this photo, but wasn't very successful. However, what was successful, and still exists to this day, is the Mac Mini. The difference is that the Apple Power Mac G4 Cube still uses its own display and thus became very expensive, not to mention all the technical issues with a nearly fanless design. The Mac Mini, on the other hand, was built around a BYOKDM. Sorry if I had the order wrong. So bring your own display, keyboard and mouse design. And this still persists to this day, making it a very successful 5th product in the computer line of Apple. Then there is iPod, which was the one of the first new products lines that Steve Jobs really pushed forward after the Matrix. The iPod contained thousands of songs on one device. Of course, there is a problem. Apple core of the Beatles and Apple Computer clashed for nearly 30 years over using the name Apple. There were several legal battles about this, and eventually Apple Core declared that they would stay outside the electronics industry, and Apple Computer stood out of the music industry. However, with the iPod and the iTunes software, which would first allow you to catalog music and then outright sell music to people via the iTunes store, this didn't really work out until 2007. Then Apple created this exclusive Beatles iPod box. After the success of iPod, Apple sought to reinvent this phone, creating iPhone, and a phone that had a single big screen and integrated iPod, iPad and old cell phones into one device. Just like with the Macintosh and the Lisa. Without the iPhone, Android would have looked very different. And of course the main inspiration for iPhone was iPad. As the iPad was getting developed, Apple thought we're going to combine an iPad, internet functionality, which with an iPod's highly intuitive music interface, and cellular telephony, and it would have a revolutionary phone. This actually delayed the iPad by quite a couple of years as well. And of course it's had quite a lot of development over the years. Right here, this is a little hole with all the apps that have ever been developed for iPhone and iPad. They have literally transformed the digital economy by introducing those apps. Lots and lots of apps. It is worth noting that Apple actually had two transitions. One from PowerPC to Intel, which was in 2005, and one very recently from Intel to Apple Silicon, which was the same technology that made iPad and iPhone possible. Here was actually the reason for that PowerPC to Intel transition. That was the PowerMac G5, which really pushed PowerPC to the limit. Back in the 1990s, it already said that PowerPC eats Pentium for lunch or something. Actually now, Intel was becoming more potent and more powerful and power efficient than PowerPC. So for instance, whereas a PowerPC based computer that used, or PowerPC based Pro laptop with a G5 would have been impossible, it was very well possible to make a new MacBook Pro with an Intel CPU. Moving right along, it's the immediate successor of the PowerMac G5, which is the Mac Pro, which was introduced in 2006 and produced until 2013, having had multiple iterations after that. It was actually the first Intel-based professional desktop computer of Apple, and was up to twice as fast in video editing and 3D. Now I'm at the last part of the Apple Museum, the Apple Watch, which created the first ever digital wearable watch that had a design about fashion and was also designed to be a companion to your smartphone, of course iPhone only. Each iteration of the watch brought new features to it, all the way to where we are right now. Of course, what a grand story of Apple's that has been told quite a couple times before. However, the Apple Museum in Utrecht is unique in these tellings in that it has interactive parts as well as visualizations of the stories behind Apple in a very realistic, actually real way. So if you're just around the Utrecht city and area, I would definitely recommend you go ahead and take a visit to the Apple Museum. In fact, I may not even be able to do the full story and the overall experience within the museum full justice. But that's not the point of this video. It just told you that it exists and some important baseline stories that define who Apple is right in this very moment. So, of course, I also hope to see you another time. Bye bye! I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do, please give a thumbs up and share this video with all your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.